special live discussion on China's carbon pledge and ways to make it work. This event is held in collaboration with the China International Capital Corporation, or CICC. We are live on our CGTN app, Weibo, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Please feel free to leave a comment. Now, in September 2020, China has announced that it will reach carbon emission peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. How does the country achieve these momentous targets? What should be done, and what are the pitfalls that we should avoid? It is the purpose of this discussion today to hopefully shed some light on these important issues of our time. We have three distinguished guests with us today. Dr. Peng Wensheng is the chief economist of CICC. And we also have two other guests joining us via video link. Madame Laurence Toubiana is the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. Before that, she was France's climate change ambassador and special representative for COP21, and as such, a key architect of the landmark Paris Agreement. Following COP21 and through COP22, she was appointed UN high-level champion for climate change. Lord Nicholas Stern is the former chief economist at the World Bank, and he now chairs the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. He is the author of the 2006 Review on the Economics of Climate Change, or more broadly known as the Stern Review. It is one of the most important papers discussing the real economic implications of addressing or not addressing climate change. Now, CICC has recently published a book called Guidebook to Carbon Neutrality in China. It is this book that brought us here. It is this very topic that we are here to discuss today. If you're interested in the subject, you can download an open access version of it from the official website of the publisher Springer. Now, let's get started. Before we go into the discussion, here's a question for all three of our guests to get the conversation rolling. Now, CICC's book envisions three possible scenarios for China's climate actions. Scenario one, efforts to achieve carbon neutrality are unsuccessful and global climate change causes severe damage to humanity, and that is a very grim prospect. Scenario number two, carbon neutrality is achieved mainly by raising the cost of energy consumption, so the world economy suffers from protracted stagflation. Or scenario number three, carbon neutrality is achieved thanks to technological advances and international cooperation, and as a result, the world switches to a new development pattern. I'm guessing all of us here would really want to see scenario three, but please use 1 minute to lay your best case that you believe can convince people that scenario three can be achieved. Let's start with you, Dr. Peng.
I'm cautiously optimistic about achieving scenario three. For 2 points. First is the political case. We have seen increasing recognition by the private sector and probably more importantly, by the governments around the world to the seriousness of climate change. And this has translated into actions. Particularly, we have seen after the recent Glasgow summit, we have seen accelerated momentum in international collaboration on this issue. And we know that climate change is, in economics, what we call a negative externality of a major scale. And therefore, public policy, the role of government is very important. And we are seeing actions on this front, including China, right? China now, on per capita basis, China's carbon emission is about 40% of that of the US. On cumulative basis per capita, we are only 14% of that of the US. Right? So we have very different starting points, but still the Chinese government has committed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So the first point is the political momentum in China and around the world. The second case is technology. We have seen significant progress in technology, in green energy and associated infrastructure in the past decade. We have seen drastic declines in the prices of solar power, wind power, etc. And even in some areas, those technologies in the early stage of development, we are seeing increasing investment in those areas. And therefore, with government support, with the private sector's participation in technology innovation, the political will and technology progress combined, I believe that, I'm not saying we don't have any challenges or any hurdles, but if we take right actions from now, we should be able to make it happen.
Thank you. Madame Tubiana, are you optimistic, and why or why not?
I am optimistic because on one side, this transformation is happening, and in particular, of course, we see that it's enormous political commitment from the Chinese government and the reaction, the positive reaction of the private sector. And in a way, globally, it's happening already. For example, on the electrification of vehicles or the green steel, the rate of progress is really outpacing many, and certainly my expectation when we finish the negotiation in Paris in 2015. Our colleague, of course, has talked about renewable, now the most cost competitive. Just look at the 2020 comments of IEA saying that the solar energy is now the cheapest one in history. So that's really the positive factor. A potential hurdle, energy storage is becoming more competitive very fast. And Bloomberg, for example, analysis recently thought that by 2030, we'll see a 20-fold the market to grow for energy storage. And half of this installation of the mega batteries, but others as well, techniques in US and China. So what I see on the China own path, this makes a stronger case for technology, leading the world in renewable developments. Evidently, cumulative installed wind capacity is 39% of the global share, solar 36%. And at the same time, I think, in a way, everybody sees, and certainly the Chinese leadership, that carbon neutrality is an area where we see the greatest amount of cooperation possible and actual. So despite low expectation I had at the beginning on Glasgow, because of course times were so difficult, we have showed the importance of this multilateral movement, including, of course, the China-US joint statement. I see now the Paris Agreement framework accepted across the board, of course, for government who sign it up, but also the multilateral development banks, the financial sector, businesses, etc. So Paris is working, and I think China has been, of course, a powerful actor behind Paris Agreement becoming the norm. And that's why everybody recognized in Glasgow that we have to call to enhance national determined contribution at COP27. But of course, it will not be a soft and a road. It will be a bumpy road. There are hurdles. We have seen that with the electricity market crisis in Europe and elsewhere. We have, of course, problem of volatility. There is elements of the just transition which are very important. So it will not be a soft pathway, a soft travel. But I'm optimistic about there is no other choice. The other choice will be really very, very damaging for all. And second, there is all the solution almost ready to do and achieve it, even if the commitment of China is a very ambitious one. We recognize it.
Lord Stern, your take?
Thank you very much. Clearly, the first scenario, that we do very little and we severely damage the climate, simply destroys the prospects for future generations. That is so bad, I hope we would not contemplate. The second scenario, that somehow we can get to net zero by cutting right back on energy or output, is simply not plausible. We are, as a world, if you look at all emissions, CO2 equivalent, close to 60 billion tons a year. We have to get that down to net zero. You don't get to net zero by having zero consumption or zero energy or zero people. It's simply not plausible or feasible. So we have to go for option 3. The question is not are you optimistic about getting there? And the question is, how do you get there? Because we have to. Once we are committed, and China, of course, is very clearly committed, then you start to see that this is actually the growth story of the 21st century. It's full of discovery, innovation, investment, growth. It is also full of benefit. We kill, as a world, perhaps 8, 9, 10 million a year from air pollution, and a big majority of that is from fossil fuels. The number of people who die in the world each year is a bit over 50 million. This is huge in terms of deaths in the world. And of course, it's not simply deaths, it's the damage we do to health across the board. We can have cities where we can move and breathe and be productive. We can have ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. We can live healthier, more productive lives. We can be more resource efficient. So we have to understand that this is not a narrow trade-off, paying a bit more to be a bit cleaner. This is, as you put it at the beginning, Jan, and as is clear in the report, this is a new form of growth and development. The challenge then is to make it happen, and make it happen quickly. And I think we all agree that even though this is enormously attractive, that does not mean it is easy. It means for most of the world, increasing investment. That is a real challenge. In China, it means changing the pattern of investment, because China already invests a great deal. So there are very big policy challenges how you make that happen. As Laurent said, we already have the technologies. We're going to have to invest and develop some more. But on that, I think we can see where the world is going, including in the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. So the challenge is to put policy in place so that the investment that we need actually happens, and that we manage that transition. So we have to have the picture of what we need to do. That is option 3, scenario 3. We have to recognize how attractive it can be. We have to recognize that we have many of the technologies that we need, and we can develop the others. But we should not assume that it's going to be easy, because these changes are very big and they have to happen very quickly. So that is the challenge, and the book, I think, is about the right thing, how we make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, let me deduce, if I may, that one of the key factors behind the optimism that we can achieve carbon neutrality is, one, the substantial lowering of the cost of green solutions, and most importantly, the commitments from policymakers around the world and among the general public that in order to save the future, this has to be done. Now, Dr. Peng, let me start today's discussion by asking you what this book sets out to accomplish.
I think Professor Stern has described it well. This is a new form of economic development. So I think this is a force that will transform the world in terms of economy, society, for the many decades to come. And in this process, what are the critical issues? What are the challenges, hurdles that we will encounter? And what are the new opportunities for economic growth, for social development that may emerge? How the government or public policy play a role in this process? So these are the issues that we attempt to address in this book. This is a joint effort by CICC Research Department and the CICC Global Institute. CICC Global Institute is a think tank we established in November 2020. And we mobilized 4 macro teams and more than 20 sector teams to study both the macro and industrial sector-specific issues. So we combined top-down and bottom-up approach together to provide some analysis. And I believe this is the first attempt in China to give a systematic analysis of the issues. So I hope this will be, this book will be of useful reference for people who are interested in this issue and who want to better understand the prospects for China in this green transition.
Thank you very much. Madame Tubiana, here's a question for you. You talked about the lowering of installation costs and other costs for green solutions around the world. And given your track record of fostering international collaboration, how should developed economies better help developing ones reap the benefits of these new green technologies?
Thank you for that question. And first, maybe I would really to pay tribute to this excellent report and so important at that particular moment in time. You know, no country knows exactly what is a pathway for carbon neutrality by mid-century or soon after. And the way that the exercise of thinking and scenarios and thinking how to do that is really important to create the trust between all countries. So I wanted just to really pay my tribute to that very important exercise, and I will make sure that many people are reading it. When you look at the scope of cooperation between countries, and you know the vast array of different levels of development around the globe, I see that there is, even if we are facing, let's be frank and recognize a huge geopolitical tension we are facing, nevertheless, there is a move on the international cooperation to go for green. I'm referring, of course, to the Green Belt and Road Initiative, which now is deploying with new, after the commitment of China to stop funding coal investment abroad. We have the Global Gateway, and we have, of course, the Build Back Better World that the US has launched. So we could see this as a totally separate exercise that could not, in a way, work together. My bet is, because of the green orientation, the convergence, we could gather these efforts and develop cooperation together. I say that because, of course, China, US, and Europe are the big players in that realm. So I do think these programs have a mutually reinforcing benefits, more incentives, more crowding in green finance, particularly private finance, of course. The blended finance, for example, we see is important. We are looking for it like now for many years, but now we have probably a framework where public finance can develop the tools to crowd in the private finance. Just an example, what happened to the EU Africa Union Summit last week. EU pledged 150 billion investment euros over the next 7 years. I remember that the China Africa Summit earlier in the year 2021 has designed some areas of cooperation on the same lines. So there is elements that we could cooperate to recreate the trust anyway, with understanding that developed countries has to ramp up that funding, and not only through bilateral, but as Nick Stern says repeatedly, and we should listen to him, all the multilateral development banks instrument that are available, that has to come in to mobilize this funding for developing countries. So there is this element we have at both sides, tension, but at the same time possibility, because the objectives now are set the same. And I think that really should foster cooperation. But it's not only about investment and technology on these three big powers' hands. It's about as well a just transition and the accompanying of developing countries through this process, which is really, really tricky. In the IES scenario, we have 14 million jobs are created worldwide through decarbonization, but we have 5 million jobs are lost. And so it's hard to imagine the macro, the societal impacts of such a rewiring of the job market. And I would see that beyond the discussion of ramping up the funding, in particular before or at COP27, the second element is of course to use this big investment sort of framework and portfolio that China, EU, and US have been developing, but at the same time think together about how we will accompany the lowest developing countries in their transition. And that's where experience, practices, and support is very, very essential. So creating some elements, some funding, some mechanism for accompanying the transition, in my view, is a very important element to, in a way, respond to uncertainty and concerns that governments have. So how you transform, how you go to carbon neutrality when you have to modify deeply your job market. And in particular, I think cooperation, triangular cooperation between China, Europe in particular, seems to me still very, very possible. And I see some very good example, in particular vis-a-vis countries in Africa that has to go through their energy transitions themselves now.
Thank you very much. Dr. Peng, the world is still quite dependent on fossil fuels today, and so does China. But how do you envision the country's energy structure to be like by the year 2060? What should the composition be?
Currently, fossil fuel energies account for about 80% of energy consumption in China. And by our estimate, presented in this book, if we want to achieve net zero emission by 2060, that ratio needs to be reduced to about 20%. Now, so this is a big change. That's why we say this profound transformation.
Very ambitious.
Yeah, very ambitious. Now, the question is how this can come about. In this book, we stressed this concept of green premium, which basically is, we want to reduce the cost of renewable energy relative to fossil fuels. And we want to reduce it so that people have incentives to use green energy rather than coal, oil, etc. Now, there are three ways in this process, or three key elements. One is what I mentioned earlier, probably the most important one, technology innovation. The government needs to invest, the private sector needs to invest in innovations. Secondly, we need to internalize some of these externalities so that our behavior, business individuals, will be incentivized to change. And we can do this by carbon tax or carbon pricing to raise the cost of fossil fuels. Thirdly, the third element, I think, we need to build up a public policy and more generally, the social institutions that will promote public involvement in this green transition. And this includes, for example, regulations on some green standards. So these three elements, they are not mutually exclusive. They work together. They are complementary to each other. Right? For example, if we don't have any pain, if carbon emission is free, right, then there will be no incentives for the private sector to invest in new technologies. Right? But if we rely mostly on carbon pricing or carbon tax, that will also raise a lot of problems, particularly for the disadvantaged groups. And technology progress also has an externality. That is, the benefit is enjoyed by everyone, but the import is by individual institutions. So from that angle, public policy, government investment in research and development is very important.
So basically, the key to creating green transition is reflected in how much incentive you can give to the economy, to the players in the economy to change their energy structure, change their growth model. And such incentives, I believe, often reflects in, for example, costs and prices of energy. The book mentions that industries such as cement and chemicals will still be relying a lot on carbon capture and storage technology going forward to curb emissions. But it also mentions that such technologies are nowhere near mature, so i.e. they will be very expensive. So if we are to go down that road, will it be very costly? Will we sacrifice economic growth to get there? How big of a challenge do you see that?
So this is the importance of technology progress. 10 years ago, many people believe that 10 years ago the cost of solar power, like solar PVs, right, are a lot more expensive than we are seeing today. Right? But how we have reduced the such cost? Government subsidies at that time by Chinese government. I remember at the time a lot of people criticized this, saying this is government subsidies for industries, it's not an efficient allocation of resources, etc. But exposed looking back, this has been a very successful experience. And this comes back to the point I made earlier. Technology innovation is, has these positive externalities. And therefore, government's role, public investment is very important. So, yes, carbon capture, carbon storage is still at the very early stage, hydrogen, early stage of development. But if we pay adequate importance to this green transition, both the public sector and the private sector, I'm confident that given us 20, 30 years, we will come out with new technologies to overcome this issue.
Thank you. Lord Stern, how big of a challenge is such insufficient of technological level globally when it comes to curbing carbon emission?
I think that we must recognize that for something like 25 or 30% of our emissions, the clean technologies are already cheaper than the dirty technologies, even without subsidy, even without carbon price. That's in large measure in electricity power generation. And that advantage of the clean technologies is becoming stronger year by year, month by month, as the cost of those technologies go on falling. In transportation, I think we're quite close to being cheaper with clean technologies than with dirty technologies. Electric vehicles are simply more efficient than the internal combustion engine vehicles. It's a question of sharpening the technology, going to scale, or putting in place the complementary infrastructure like charging stations and so on. So we should recognize that in electricity and transportation, we're either already cheaper doing it clean or very close to that. So it's not true that across the economy it's cheaper to go dirty than it is to go green. The hard to abate sectors, things like steel and cement and air transportations and so on, are coming. And there, that is an area where the world must both compete and collaborate to drive down those technologies. So I think the areas where it will be more expensive to be clean, 15 years or so from now, will be quite small parts of the economy. Likely still to be true in some areas, but they will be small parts of the economy. So the challenge really is to move very quickly in investing now at the same time as we work to drive down the costs of the areas, costs of being clean, green in areas that at the moment are more expensive. So I think the program of work is clear, and we'll need both competition and collaboration to get there, and we'll need good policies to incentivize the use of the technologies we already know and to pull through those other technologies.
So there are indeed quite a lot of encouraging signs, which brings us to the next question for you, which is, of course, about your view on the Stern Review today. In your paper, you basically said that the case for urgent action is actually much more urgent than many had estimated. Now, more than 15 years later, has your assessment changed?
I'm very happy to comment on the Stern Review, but can I begin? Excuse me. Can I begin by agreeing with Laurence about the importance of this review?
Sure.
China is the most important country, and this is a very detailed, careful review of how China will change. So before talking about my own review, I just want to underline my support for this review. But looking back, I argued that the cost of action is far less than the cost of inaction. Looking back, I understated the case. If you look at the cost of inaction, doing not very much, letting the climate change happen, we now see from the science that that is still more dangerous than we thought 15 years ago. When we were writing the report, we simply had IPCC, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change reports on the science. We just had IPCC 3. And now we've got 6. We've had 4, 5, and 6, 3 more reports. And of course, we've had the report on 1.5 degrees. Each report has looked more worrying than the other. So the first observation is that the cost of inaction, which I argued was very high, is still higher than we argued then, because we have been slow to move as a world, and the science has looked ever more worrying. If you switch over to the cost of action, then I think the cost of action is far less than we thought at the time, because we did not anticipate 15 years ago. I don't think anybody anticipated 15 years ago how fast technology would change. And that's a very good example of how human commitment, ingenuity, discovery can work if people collectively examine the magnitude of the problem and the seriousness of the problem. And really on policy, which has not been very strong, it's been there, we've seen very rapid technical change, and I think we can see still more rapid technical change if our policies get still stronger. We didn't anticipate that the cost of solar would come down by a factor of 10, that the cost of storage of electricity would fall so fast. We didn't anticipate that every major manufacturer of vehicles is now declaring the end of the era of the internal combustion engine. We didn't think of green steel through green hydrogen being on the horizon. Of course, it is on the horizon now, indeed not so far away. So technology has moved faster than we thought, and thus the cost of action has gone down. So the cost of inaction has gone up, cost of action has gone down. So looking back, I think the report, the Stern Review, understated the case. The case was still stronger. Looking at the politics has been mixed, but I think that the Paris Agreement of 2015 was a hugely valuable step forward, and that, I think, has given the world a shared goal, a shared understanding. And we must pay tributes to the work of France and Laurence and her team and the UNFCCC under Cristiano Figueres and their team in generating that. So the third area is politics, and politics has moved backwards and forwards. It moved backwards at the time of Trump, it's moved forwards at the time of Paris, and more recently at Glasgow. So I do think the politics has changed. The politics in China on all this has changed enormously since 2006 when we published our report. The politics in India has changed. A very important speech from Prime Minister Modi at Glasgow last November, declaring a new path for India's growth. So the politics, I think, has moved quite strongly in a good direction, but not fast enough, not far enough, and there have been some backwards and forwards in that politics. The private sector as a whole, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, has moved enormously. The private sector is now telling us that this is the biggest reallocation of capital since the Industrial Revolution. Just look at Philip Hildebrand, the vice chair of the biggest of the funds, BlackRock. They recognize where it's all going. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with $130 trillion of assets under management, really around half of the assets under management has declared for net zero. So the private sector, particularly in the last few years, has moved very rapidly. On the policy side, that's the fifth area. On the policy side, I think we've gone much deeper now than we did 15 years ago. We recognize very clearly that the greenhouse gas externality, the biggest market failure the world has ever seen, is not the only one. It's big, it's important, we have to tackle it directly, it's number one. But as Weng Sheng said, the research and development area is one where the publicness of knowledge is very important. Markets can't work unaided by themselves. So too, capital markets, which are going to be very important in their management of risk, they don't work so well, there's going to be policy there. Much of this is networks, whether it's electricity grids or broadband, recycling. Networks need public policy. They are not areas where markets can work unaided. There are tremendous issues around information. And of course, there are great issues around the co-benefits, as I mentioned before, including, and very importantly, air pollution. So I added 5 market failures, market problems to the first one, number one, which is the greenhouse gas externality. So we see now much more deeply, I think, that public policy must be acting right across the board in all these areas if we're to get the pace of change and the level and nature of investment we need. But above all, as I mentioned earlier, and I want to underline, we now see that if we get this right, this is the growth story of the 21st century and a really attractive one.
Yes, you have reiterated on many occasions, as you have reiterated just now, that the cost of when it comes to energy generation, the cost of going dirty is not necessarily less than going green at this day and age. But what about the short term? The dilemma that we cannot avoid in the short term is really the balancing act between economic growth and curbing emissions, if there is still one, especially as the pandemic continues to weigh on global economy. And how do you see the challenge that some economies and investors are increasing their short-term exposure to more traditional profit generators that are not necessarily green-oriented?
Yeah, I think that's an artificial horse race. And I do think that coming out of COVID and getting ourselves onto a new growth path is about investment. And that investment and creative, innovatory investment is what will drive us forward. And that will raise income, it will restart growth, it will generate jobs, as Laurence was describing. And that, I think, is a very clear message. It's a very clear strategy. And the job of policy is to enable that strategy. So I do not think that the short-run COVID story points in the direction of slowing action on climate change. The other way around, I think it points to the direction of increasing action, because we need as a world to have a new form of growth. We need to grow much more strongly in a different way. And the right way to do that is investment. And that investment will create the opportunities and the incomes. There'll be a few areas where life will be a bit more expensive, but they'll be offset by other areas where life will be a lot cheaper. I do think that handling uncertainty is a very important part of this process. And I think we have to move to an era where we're much less dependent on fossil fuels from the point of view of uncertainty and risk. Volatility in the fossil fuel markets has been with us since the Second World War. And we've had many crises in the world around the volatility of fossil fuel markets. So one of the advantages here is that we will avoid those kinds of volatilities in the future if we switch away from these dirty technologies. And that point, I think, has come through particularly strongly in these last months.
Dr. Peng, what about the case of China? We know that some of the more traditional energy-rich regions in the country are usually less developed regions.
Last October, we have this electricity crunch in some part of China. I think that is a case, illustrate the delicate balance between the short-term objectives and the long-term goals. I think the process is really about how you balance the interest of the current generation and the future generation. Now, at the aggregate or macro level, I agree very much with Professor Stern that one way to address this issue is to increase investment in green technology, which longer term it provides new supplies of energy, short term it supports demand, support economic growth. But there's another element, particularly for a big country like China, that is it's not so much about inequality or about current and future generation. It's about inequality within the current generation, different regions, right? For example, in China, we have some provinces in the northern part of the country that are important producers of fossil fuels. So they will need to go through a difficult transformation in the next few decades. And how to address this, and I believe, again, public policy is the key here, particularly fiscal policy, to provide financial assistance and other policy support to help these regions to change their economic structure, their employment structure, so that this process of transformation will be a smooth one. At least will not invite so much backlash, social political backlash to harm this path towards carbon neutrality. But in the end, I would say we shouldn't expect pain-free process, right? Without pain, how people will change their behavior, right? Technology innovation will not come out of nowhere, right? You need some incentives. So I think in reality, the policy is to strike the balance. Not too much pain at a particular point of time, but also still provide incentives for private sector behavioral change.
Could I just come in here? I think the challenge is not to manage pain by going slowly. It's because we have to act so quickly if we're to avoid the climate change dangers. I think the challenge is to manage the change and to build a just transition So if you reduce jobs in coal, then the challenge is to invest in people and places where that coal production took place so that they can have a different and new future. So I think going slower is not necessarily a good way to manage the dislocations and the difficulties. Managing the dislocations and the difficulties has to be done directly and energetically, and it does involve investment in people and places, and we have to make sure that that happens. In my own country, the UK, we managed the decline of the coal industry extremely badly, and we had long-term unemployment in some parts of the countries, and we had civil strife. It was a deep cost, which I remember very well in those times, particularly in the 1980s. So I think very active management of change and dislocation is a critical part of the story. And the second observation is that there will be some policy mistakes. And I think if China looks back at the experience of last autumn, the message went out correctly that we must improve energy efficiency and we must change the sources of energy. This was the double correct, strong message in China. But it seems in some places that was interpreted as simply cutting energy. And so I do think, I've talked about big mistakes in my own country. I think there will be mistakes in China. I hope there'll be smaller mistakes. But looking very carefully at policy, thinking about policy, looking at the messages from this book, I think will be a very important part of the story. But we have to recognize that if we're making change on this magnitude, there will be dislocation and there will be mistakes along the way. So we have to be extremely attentive and active in the management of change.
Madame Tubiana, I also want to get your take on this balancing act, especially your take on developing countries where this is much more of a developmental issue.
Well, I think we should not think in these terms anymore, because what is the value of envisaging the development which needed? Access to energy, access to food, access to decent housing, good jobs, really a good life. Thinking that the past model we have been going through will bring a really substantial benefit to developing countries. And you know, of course, there is a long-term element on the generations, the future generation, but on the other side, even locally, the price being paid by these models, which is based still a lot in many countries, including in Europe, on fossil fuel for producing energy, is causing really already today pain. Air pollution is a very good example. And there are many, many more of them. So, and really, when I look at the problem of volatility of prices and the shock that we are witnessing, it's not the first time. It has been several. We have witnessed that since now almost once a decade or even more. You see that the shock are always not very evenly distributed. So this shock to the economy have no benefit. The only benefit of this, by the way, have been that progressively we are trying to shift out from the fossil fuel base of the global commodities market that are really very unstable. So that's why I think it's really important to reassess what development models can, and that particularly, of course, this report, I was really interested to see that not only about technology, there was elements on technology, which I'll maybe come back a little later, the policy instruments, which are really important, and I find it was a sophisticated analysis in there. But that's the social organization and the lifestyles and the what kind of, in a constrained world where of course natural resources are limited, and we are causing a lot of damages because of this very extractive model we have been developing now more than 2 centuries or even more. How we can really live all together in a planet with a good life. And I think that's where we need innovation, that is not only technology, but social and and in a way, the way the innovation is developed in societies. And I like these chapters in the book around that. So that first, I think we should not accept the idea that development means dirty development anymore. Anyway, as Nick said in many of his papers, and IPCC particularly, scenarios, and it's not only now scenario, we are observing the damages. There is no growth story there. We can't. Taking the example of China, of course, a massive player in there, the risk for China of a huge, really heavy climate change, well below 2 degrees, well beyond 2 degrees C, are enormous. So I think it's in everyone's interest to think, and even looking at the lowest developed countries, like some countries in Africa that really suffer from not a good access to energy, the damage on climate change on them is really immense. We have seen harvest drop enormously because of the now 2 or 3 more years of drought in many of the region, and now more people are lacking access to food. So this is, I think it's really important to say it's not about development or no development, it's just different style of development and different orientation. I wanted just to build back on the problem of the idea that, because there are short-term priorities and then we should focus on them, and the policy, sometimes the governments are very focused on them and forget the long plan investment or all the structural institutional development that is needed to play and to accelerate this economic and social and technological revolution. And I was thinking, maybe it's not about all this short term we have to, and it's exactly the discussion we have in Europe these days, a backlash against climate policy, in a way saying, look, we have to deal with these very high prices on gas. We have to find sources to get more fossil fuel energy in the loop. We should continue investing in them, where in reality, yes, we have to manage the shock, but there are particular policies to do that. It's not that difficult in a way. It's costly, but you can transfer for the lowest income levels for them to cushion the shock of the volatility. But the security issue is basically to go for independent energy security providers, which is renewable energy everywhere. And that is, to me, a lesson. I hope that in Europe after this, and again, because of these terrible political tensions these days, people are not focused on, finally, security is equaling having not to fight for fossil fuel resources at world level, and to try to, it's not a good competition for anybody. And I would say, in this massive technological revolution we are witnessing and we have to accelerate, we may need to manage better this problem of how we rely on, because we rely still on a lot of natural resources. In particular, we need mineral, we need metals to, in a way, support the move to renewable energy and clean energy. But then we have to be careful not to repeat the error of the past, that it is about how we compete for the resources, and in a way that has a lot of negative consequences in the countries where the extraction is made, as well as in the country who are consuming them. That's why an element of really a very deep focus on recycling, a very deep focus on energy efficiency or efficiency in the use of resources in general is really important. And I was happy to see in the report the idea of maybe a rethinking of overconsumption models we have been living with. That is maybe not the best solution. So I think it's a systemic change we are looking at. And it's a systemic change maybe on the way to do policy, and it's interesting that China can give really a lot of lessons to the world on this long-term planning, which, planning now is back in the discussion in countries that have abandoned totally these notions. And so I think that's an important discussion globally, and I really would like to see that happening. And finally, I think we are maybe we have seen the big shift in technology, but we have to look at the local innovation and changes that many citizens are bringing. And somewhere in the report that has this aspect of the bottom-up element of the change. The systemic change cannot come from top-down only. We have different political systems, we know that, but still, even in countries where there is a more decentralized approach, there is the idea that the government will make the things happen, and reality is much more diverse than that. It's a whole ecosystem of decision, of vision, of models that we have to develop, and really embarking the citizen in the transformation is very important. I know that there are experiments in China, a lot of experiments to involve citizens in the design of the future of a number of things and policies and choices. And I was wondering if we should not really mainstream that in the global discussion on how we get this bottom-up innovation and the citizen involvement in the design of this low-carbon future. If not, in a way, we will see, again, shocks and backlash always repeating themselves.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, we know that the risks are there, the necessities are there, judging by today's discussion. Dr. Peng, one of the points that the book makes is that huge investments are needed for China to reach carbon neutrality. And we also know that one of the buzzwords right now in the investing circle is ESG, which means investments that bring environmental, social, and governance benefits. How do you see the prospect of ESG investments in China, and what should be considered ESG projects exactly?
ESG is a new phenomenon in China compared with some other countries, but it has been growing very rapidly in recent years. Now, I think if in China, ESG, the most important part probably is E, related to environmental issues, and the government's commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 has injected a major momentum into this ESG movement. And in this book, we estimate that by 2060, to achieve our objective, we need to invest about 140 trillion renminbi. That is more than 20 trillion US dollar. And therefore, it's a big challenge for the financial system in China to support this investment. In this area, public policy has played an important role. So in a way, I would say ESG in China is more top-down when compared with probably in countries in Europe. And we have seen a lot of actions by policy banks in China. We have seen People's Bank of China recently launched these lending facilities to support carbon emission reduction, provide lending to commercial banks that finance, provide loans to finance new green projects at, I would say, a big concessionary terms. So that's, I would say, that's the big picture, and I see a lot of potential for growth in this area. Policy lending or policy-related investment aside, another area is what Professor Stern mentioned earlier: capital market. Capital market plays a lot of role in promoting technology innovation. And in China, we have seen recently a lot of reforms that have been implemented to support the development of capital market in China. So I think that's the new area we see a lot of potential in ESG. I would say in some, I like the word used by Madame Tibiana, that constraints, new constraints. Actually, in this book, the subtitle is Macro and Industry Trends Under New Constraints. So under those new constraints, we need a new form of economic development, and finance is a key part of that. So I think we should see rapid growth in ESG, particularly in the green area.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Let's talk more policy. One of the most important ways for policymakers to curb carbon emission is really by putting a price tag on carbon. It is done usually through a carbon tax or having a carbon market. Lord Stern, how do you compare the pros and cons of both methods when you look at all the cases globally?
I will answer that question very directly, but let me for a moment put it in what I think is the right context. We have to think of the greenhouse gas externality, that huge market failure, alongside the other market failures that are going to make a very big difference to investment. We've already spoken about research and development and capital markets. But as I underlined earlier, in addition, there are networks, all the electricity networks, how they function, how the grid functions in China, how the grid functions in Europe, are big problems which make life difficult for renewables. So the networks are very important, not just the electricity grids, but the broadband and the recycling and the public transport as well. And there's information where people have to know what's possible. And then we've had the air pollution and the co-benefits. So as we focus in on the first of the market failures, we must be sure that we do not forget about those other market failures, because they're absolutely critical. And when we think about policy and regulation, prices and regulation, we must not forget about design. A lot of this is about design, city design, how our cities function, as Laurence was emphasizing. That's of enormous importance as well. And that kind of design is not only top-down, it's bottom-up, as Laurence was recognizing. So as we focus in on carbon taxes and carbon markets, let's have those bits of context very clear in our minds, that we have to tackle the other market failures if the right kind of investment is going to come through. And we have to think of regulation and design as well, and systemic change as part of that problem. Turning then from that context into the issue of carbon taxes and carbon markets. Crudely speaking, carbon markets have targets for overall emissions and try to use the price mechanism to reach those targets. Carbon taxes look straight at the taxes and they fix the price rather than the quantity. And those are two different ways of approaching the problem. In a world with no uncertainty, in a world with no administrative costs, in a world with no increasing returns to scale, those two things will be identical in their effects. But of course, we live in a world of uncertainty. We live in a world of increasing returns to scale and so on. So we have to bear those things in mind when we make our comparison between carbon taxes and carbon markets. I think administratively, carbon taxes have advantages, and I think in terms of clarity, carbon taxes have advantages. And probably my instincts now would be to emphasize carbon taxes a bit more. On the other hand, if you look back into the position in Europe, where the emissions trading scheme came in many years ago now, the politics of bringing that scheme in, were probably easier than the politics of a big carbon tax, because you could give allowances to incumbents so that at least at the beginning, their position was more or less unchanged, and on the margin they got the right kind of price incentives through the carbon markets. But we saw how they could be mismanaged, and we had a long period in Europe of very low carbon prices because the economy slowed down and they went on giving out the same amount of, or a similar amount of permits to emit. So I think from the point of view of clarity of signal, stability, the balance of the argument, I think, has shifted a bit further over towards carbon taxes, particularly now that people have got much more used to the idea than they used to be. But nevertheless, there are advantages to both schemes. The clarity on quantity is a real advantage for the carbon markets if used well. So I don't want to sort of come down too strongly on one versus the other, but I have to confess that over time, from the point of view of simplicity and clarity and stability of price, I've become more convinced on the carbon tax. And of course, the carbon tax gives you very directly revenues, which you can use particularly to compensate poorer people for any change in prices as a result. In principle, you can get the revenues from the carbon markets if you auction the permits properly. But on the whole, countries have moved too slowly on that, in my view. But I found the book, very, very helpful on this issue. There's no, as it were, absolutely clear answer that you must have prices or you must have markets. It's a question of where you find yourself, how fast you can move. But I've given you the indication now of where I come out, that's increasingly in favor of taxes.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I want to thank our three guests for a very informative discussion. Now we open the floor for some Q&A. Please raise your hand if you have any questions for our guests. That lady over there.
Thank you very much for our distinguished guests, and I've learned a lot from this insightful discussion. My question is also related to carbon price that we just discussed. As Stern, you have stated back in, I think, 2017 in Paris, a very effective carbon price would be $50 to $100 per ton. And we see in the European carbon market, the price has grown very dramatically over the past 1 year. But in China, the price is still around 15 to 60 RMB per ton. So how do you comment on the carbon price, both in Europe and in China? And also to Mrs. Turbena, I would like to have your insight on what are some areas in the industry or in finance sector you've seen the largest impact of a carbon price increase. Thank you.
Lord Stern, why don't you go first?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Well, very simply, I think the price in Europe is moving in a good direction, and the price in China is too low. Now, I understand that it takes time to push up carbon prices, but we don't have very much time. So my first response would to our Chinese friends, and as many of you will know, I've been working in China since the 1980s, so I hope sometimes I can use we in terms of friends working together. I do think pushing up prices in China quickly makes a lot of sense, and using that revenue in a very productive way, partly for distribution, partly for investment in new technologies, and of course partly to support developing countries around the world. So my first answer is to push up the price in China. But second, I would make the observation that we're going to see carbon border adjustment mechanisms increasing around the world, particularly in Europe. That means that there would be a tax of some sort on an import from a country with weak climate policies. So if countries are moving slowly, they will find themselves with a tax when they try to sell into Europe. That may happen in other countries as well. that means you're better off collecting the tax in your own country, because that way you get the revenue. So there's an advantage, as it were, in a world where carbon border adjustment mechanisms will increase, to actually being active on policy so that you get the revenue. But I do think that we must think beyond, as I argued already, carbon prices alone. And I do think in assessing how strongly a country is acting on climate, it's much more than looking at the level of the carbon price. You know, a ban on the sale of internal combustion engines after a certain date is, in the UK, it's 2030. In a number of other countries have that as well. China's moving strongly in that direction. That's quite a powerful signal. A commitment to change the energy system in the UK to electricity system to net zero by 2035 is a strong signal. So whilst making the point that carbon prices in China should be higher, I think also we have to recognize that in assessing the strengths of policy, we must look beyond simply the carbon pricing mechanisms.
Madame Dubiana? Dr. Peng, would you like to chime in?
Can I add a few words on this? I think there is a difference in two areas, in relation to what Professor Stern remarked. One is that Europe has, compared with China, has a lot more experience in this carbon trade mechanism. We know that in the modern economy, all the markets are a result of policy design and regulations, and this takes time. And this, I believe, applies to the carbon market in China. So that's the first point. The second point is that in China, more generally, we are probably much more efficient in using administrative measures in terms of regulating economic activities. Now, in this area, I don't have a definitive view, but I would say that imagine a case where if administrative measures were act on carbon price compared with other places like Europe, and my guess is that the level of price will be lower in China than let's say in Europe, because we have other alternative instruments. So I believe that's also something that we need to keep in mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Madame Tubiana. Your question, your answer to the specific question, or both questions, if you want.
One, what has happened in Europe? Of course, just speaking on Wen Cheng's argument, it took time, of course, to set up the carbon market. I remember I was at the Prime Minister office at that time when we decided to begin to run that, and it really started only in 2005, and the price initially were very low. So there is, of course, a problem of learning, and that totally understandable. Now, it hasn't had any real impact since then, minus on the electricity market, meaning the production of electricity, because of the free allowances that were distributed for the the energy-intensive sector that, of course, were absorbing the cost of the electricity and could not compete internationally. But in a way, it was a mixed bag, which finally has delayed the transformation needed in this sector. And that we are now confronted with that, where we, of course, now there is a plan to erase these allowances and to go for auctioning. But on the other side, we are seeing that if we just rely on the carbon market, for example, to go for the zero carbon steel or the zero carbon cement, which we are not there, that will not work quickly enough. And so that's why I think there is no religion to have. Of course, we need price signals. That's just very, very evident. I think it's really healthy for the ETS market to really erase these free allowances. But that, of course, as Nixon has said, that will immediately translate into then the energy will pay this tax. It will finally be equivalent of a carbon tax. But then that will be the question of the trade, and of course imports of cement and steel in particular, and some chemicals would be affected. So, as I said, this is anyway, nobody can operate this transition quickly enough, and the problem is quickly enough with only price instrument only. Ideally, yes, but then you have to correct all the market failures that Nick was describing. And you know, the ETS system doesn't respond better to this market failure than the carbon tax, a little bit, because you need at least to have an idea of the carbon budget you want to allocate. But still, there is so much pressure. There is so much, discussion. It's never a pure market. So it's not like we need all this carbon emission. The government decided to shrink that space, and then you compete for the price. This is not happening really because there is a lot of transaction costs. So that's why, combined with the speed of the transformation needed, now no government rely only, at least in the European discussion, rely only on the price instrument and really the norms and standards. Look just at the transport issue. Even if we are talking about opening a new branch of the emission trading system to transport and housing, nevertheless, all countries are pointing to an end of the internal combustion engine sales. So, it's a regulation, basically. And you have regulation, as you know, because the Chinese government and others are really looking very much at how the different markets define their standards in, for example, in emission standards. So we just we are approving a much more severe emission standard now in Europe that will finally really signal the end game for the internal combustion engine. So in a way, we are in an imperfect world. The instruments are diverse, but it's interesting to see that the price instrument is now considered one within many others. How we compare efforts internationally to try to, prevent a trade war, that's a question mark. I think the idea that if, for example, a country of China makes a choice to ramp up with the speed of the climate policy, whether it is through regulation, but again, with signaling the price, because that's something everybody can understand, and keep, as the resources for its own sake to fund this transition. That's, of course, the ideal world. We don't have trade wars, but they are really a good use. And instead of subsidizing fossil fuel energy, which is the case still now in many countries, I have not revised the data for your country, and you know better, but still in Europe we are subsidizing fossil fuel energy, and we have to shift that from a subsidy to a cost, whatever it is, through regulation or carbon tax or carbon price. Nevertheless, we have to understand that in particular on the carbon tax that imply direct transmission to consumers, there are distributive effects that are important, and we cannot ignore them. One, because we are talking about the speed of the transformation, shifting in 10 years' time from an internal combustion engine transport system to an electric-based system, in particular for private consumers, is a huge effort in terms of capital investment for them. So if you raise the carbon tax on fuel, which is, anyway, the plan we tried in France, which is in UK, in many countries, if you don't cushion that, and it's, of course, evidently the case for the housing, the problem of course, of the heating system, if you don't provide for the cushion for the social cost, you would never have the citizen able to cope, and they will resist, and the government will finally delay action. So we can't ignore the distributive effect. Of course, ideally, the consumers could switch to another consumption immediately. That's not the case. So everything is about the transition and the way you invest on one side to make this investment cheaper, for example, having the electric vehicle at cost and the charging infrastructure in place, but really considering this as a systemic change in policy. And that's why the debate between carbon tax and carbon price, in my view, is a little bit sort of un peu historical, more than on effective these days. So that will be my comment. But at this point in time, the delay in really decarbonizing the industry in Europe has been an excessive protection from the carbon price, and that was not good. I think so.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madame Tupiana. Any more questions? That gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Three panelists all mentioned the importance of investment. And as we know that major economies, the government in major economies have released their economic recovery package to counter the negative impact of the COVID-19, the pandemic. And I think this is the whole huge opportunity for the government investment to play a bigger role. My question to the three panelists is, how do you think the importance and the role of this kind of government investment in helping the transition? Thank you.
Dr. Peng?
I'm thinking of China. China is the largest energy consumer in the world. But China is also a leading player in renewable energy in the world. Right? We are a leader in many areas. So this is a kind of a unique combination, and investment clearly is has played an important role in this. So as I say it, we need to make most use of the existing tools, technologies for reducing carbon emissions. That requires a lot of investment. We need to innovate new technologies, new tools, like what we mentioned, green hydrogen, carbon capture, storage, etc. And that also requires a lot of investment. And this second category probably requires more investment by government, because the private sector has a limited room to take a risk. So indeed, I believe this is the key area, and I believe that this is a new driver of economic growth for many countries. And to promote that, we need to see return on such investment, both exempt, which is in the equity market, we're talking about the valuation in this related areas need to be high, and also exposed. That means the actual return on such investment in terms of earnings by listed companies, it also need to grow fast. So I think overall, both the government and the private sector, particularly through the financial market, the capital market, play an important role in this.
Thank you. Madame Tupiana, your take?
I think on this investment, so first, I was concerned, I can say, when I looked at some statistics from OECD on how the recovery plans finally were addressing very little of the transformation we had to. And so it's in my view, I understand the constraint, but it was a little bit a missed opportunity. Europe did not a bad job. 30% of the recovery plans were in public investment were really to support climate-friendly activities and transformation, but that was not a radical change on the structure. And of course, now we are struggling with, can we launch a new wave of public investment? And it's a big discussion in Europe where the resources will come from. And so there is a problem of, in particular, when you have debt constraint and stability, macro stability, you have to really to preserve. You cannot do that all the time. If not, you don't have a macro framework that is probably quite rather different on the way we account for or we manage the public debt. And it, of course, not the same in a country like China, but for all European countries now, the discussion is whether now that the shock has been absorbed by the European economies, and that partially only a small part, finally relatively small part of it, has been really allocated to the Green Deal and the green transition, we need now to generate a new wave of that. And there where the problem of the stability, macro stability is coming in. And there is a huge discussion whether we can issue more green bonds, whether in times where inflation is rising again, how we will react to that. Is there any fiscal space for these countries? So I was worried, as Nixon was worried as well, as how really we embed as a central piece, even if the short-term response has to be brought to the economy, not to crack down, and it has been avoided, thankfully. But then we are now looking for new resources for this public investment to continue. So I believe, as much as our colleague said, definition, taxonomy, I was, of course, a little bit sorry to see that the gas has entered into taxonomy, whereas China hasn't made that choice, and I really commend China's choice for that. We have really to crowd in the private investment with some form of regulation, mandatory disclosure, really asking the private investment portfolio to demonstrate they are consistent with what they say, to be net zero by 2050. All this is very, very useful and needed, because that will, in a way, foster the shift in the private investment. But we need to see what is a macro framework for this massive investment we have to deliver. We have some solution within, of course, the international system, but we have to look at the maybe a new role for IMF to create that fiscal space. It's a discussion, in my view, between, of course, the big members of the international community, of the G20, to really think about opening that space. And if not, I'm worried that the short-term discussion will in a way prevail.
Thank you. Professor Stern?
I'm aware that we're running out of time, so I try to be brief. I think this is a moment for public investment, but it should be focused in areas where the multipliers in relation to private investment are as strong as possible. Because we know in most economies, private investment is 80 or 90% of investment. So the government should ask itself, where are the big multipliers? I think, for example, in city design, the multipliers can be very big, including in relation to the charging infrastructure and in public transport. The grids, investing in reforming the grids. The grids, electricity grids, are a big obstacle both in China and in Europe, and those are areas where strong government investment could have very big private sector multipliers. Invest in natural capital, in the land and the forests, where the private sector doesn't find it so easy. Invest in the just transition and managing the dislocation, which is a public sector responsibility. So focused investment in those areas where either the private sector finds it very difficult to go, or the public investment can generate, help forward a lot of private sector investment. On the fiscal side, I do think that it's a good fiscal rule to borrow to invest, not to borrow for public consumption, but to borrow for public investment, particularly now when we need to recover, and particularly now when that investment is so important to our future and has very high returns. To be responsible in the public finances, but through that rule, to borrow to invest, not for public consumption. And finally, I fully agree with what Laurent said about international responsibility to help with the fiscal space in countries which are under a lot of pressure, financial fiscal pressure as a result of COVID. And there I think that China will have a very big role to play. So China has a fundamental importance in the G20, in the IMF, in the World Bank. And China, of course, now, because it has been investing and lending abroad, and that's very good that it has been investing and lending abroad. China, of course, is a major part of the debt structure now, will have to participate as well. So I think China has a major role to play internationally around finance and the management of debt.
Thank you, Professor Stern. Because time is indeed running out, we have time for one last question. That gentleman over there.
Thank you, moderator, for granting me this opportunity to ask a question. And my question will be addressed to Dr. Peng. As we know that by 2030, China will achieve carbon neutrality, which means, peak our carbon emission, which will be in 8 years. China is going to achieve that pledge, a very ambitious pledge. How will the next 8 years unfold in front of us? What are the biggest challenges as we try to strike a balance between economic growth and carbon neutrality? That's my question. Thank you.
Well, the emission peak will be by 2030, right? So, which means that emission will continue to grow as we grow our economy. Right? So the decoupling will happen after 2030. Right? But of course, it doesn't mean that we don't, have a huge task, a lot of challenges to face in the next 80 years. I don't want to get into specifics or details, but the big point I want to make is that the difference between fossil fuels and renewable energy is that fossil fuels are natural endowments. If you have oil, you have. If you don't, you don't. Green energy is basically about manufacturing. Manufacturing has this feature of economy of scale. So as the volume increases, the scale increases, the average cost declines. And China has a huge advantage in this area because we are the largest consumer of energy. We are also the largest manufacturing economy in the world. So I believe not only for our own good, but also to contribute to this cause in the world. A lot of innovations, when applied in China, probably will make a more efficient case or faster case for economically viable applications. So I think we have this, I would say, unique opportunities, both for achieving carbon neutrality and also a new source of economic growth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peng. Now, that's all the time we have. Thank everyone for tuning in, and we also appreciate Dr. Peng Wensheng, Madame Lawrence Tubiana, and Lord Nicholas Stern for sharing their very valuable thoughts. Now, this is China's Carbon Pledge, Making It Work. If you want to take a deeper dive into the subject, do check out CICC's latest book, Guidebook to Carbon Neutrality in China. You can download an open access version of it from the official website of the publisher Springer. I'm Yang Chengxi. I'll see you next time on CGTN.